Part 1. Born of Legend and Lightning. A king is born at 20, dies at 32, conquers the world. In the summer of 356 BC, as lightning split the sky over Pella, the capital of Macedonia, a child was born who would reshape the known world before his 33rd birthday. The thunder that rolled across the mountains that night seemed to herald something momentous, something that would echo through the corridors of history for millennia to come. This was not merely the birth of another royal heir in a land of warrior kings. This was the arrival of Alexander III of Macedon, the boy who would become Alexander the Great. The very night of his birth was shrouded in omens and prophecies that would follow him throughout his extraordinary life. As Olympias of Epirus labored in the royal palace, news arrived that shook the ancient world. The temple of Artemis at Ephesus, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, had burned to the ground. The magnificent structure, with its forest of marble columns and golden statues, was consumed by flames that seemed to burn without earthly cause. The soothsayers and oracles across the Greek world immediately proclaimed this as a divine sign, the birth of one who would bring fire to Asia, a conqueror whose very existence would reshape the balance between East and West. Philip II of Macedonia, the child's father, was no ordinary king. At the time of Alexander's birth, Philip was already in the process of transforming Macedonia from a backwater kingdom into the dominant military power of Greece. His innovative phalanx formation, combining the traditional Greek hoplite tactics with Macedonian ingenuity, had proven devastatingly effective against city-state armies that had remained essentially unchanged for centuries. Philip's vision extended far beyond the rough mountains of Macedonia. He dreamed of uniting all of Greece under Macedonian hegemony and, perhaps someday, leading a pan-Hellenic crusade against the ancient enemy, Persia. But it was Alexander's mother, Olympias, who would prove equally influential in shaping the young prince's character and ambitions. A princess of Epirus and a devotee of the mystery cults, Olympias was known for her fierce intelligence, her political acumen, and her uncompromising nature. She claimed direct descent from Achilles through the royal line of Epirus, and she made sure that young Alexander knew of this legendary heritage from his earliest days. More controversially, Olympias whispered to her son that Philip was not his true father, that he had been sired by Zeus himself, the king of the gods, who had visited her in the form of a serpent. Whether Olympias truly believed these divine claims, or whether she was engaging in sophisticated political theater, the effect on Alexander was profound. From childhood, he carried himself with the bearing of one destined for greatness, one who was not bound by the ordinary limitations of mortal men. This sense of divine purpose would drive him to attempt the impossible throughout his life, to push beyond every boundary that lesser men accepted as immutable. The young Alexander's education began early and was befitting a prince who might someday rule not just Macedonia, but potentially all of Greece. He learned to read and write in both Greek and Macedonian, studied mathematics and geometry, and was instructed in the arts of war by Macedonia's finest military minds. But it was the stories of heroes and gods that truly captured his imagination. The tales of Achilles and Hector, of Odysseus and his wanderings, of Heracles and his 12 labors, these became more than entertainment for the young prince. They were templates for the kind of life he intended to live. Even as a small child, Alexander displayed characteristics that marked him as exceptional. He possessed an almost supernatural fearlessness, a quality that would serve him well in the years to come, but which often terrified those responsible for his safety. He seemed to have no concept of physical limitations or mortal danger. Palace guards told stories of finding the young prince, barely old enough to walk steadily, attempting to climb the highest towers or venture into the stables where the war horses were kept. His intellectual capabilities were equally remarkable. Alexander absorbed knowledge with a voracious appetite that impressed even his tutors. He could recite long passages from Homer's epics after hearing them just once, and he demonstrated an intuitive understanding of mathematics and logic that suggested a mind capable of grasping complex strategic concepts. More importantly, he showed signs of the kind of creative thinking that would later revolutionize military tactics. The most famous story from Alexander's childhood occurred when he was 12 years old, an incident that perfectly encapsulated the qualities that would define his character throughout his life. A horse dealer from Thessaly had brought a magnificent black stallion to Philip's court, hoping to sell the animal for the enormous sum of 13 talents. The horse was clearly of exceptional quality, tall, powerful, with the kind of presence that marked a true war horse. But there was a problem. No one could handle the beast. It reared and struck out at anyone who approached, its eyes rolling with what appeared to be genuine madness. Philip's horsemasters, men who had spent their lives working with the most spirited animals, declared the stallion untrainable and worthless. They recommended that the dealer be sent away, perhaps with a small payment for his trouble in bringing the horse such a great distance. The court began to disperse, the entertainment over, when young Alexander stepped forward. The 12-year-old prince had been watching the proceedings with intense concentration, his mind working through the problem that had defeated grown men. He approached his father and asked for permission to try where others had failed. Philip, perhaps amused by his son's presumption, or perhaps recognizing something in the boy's demeanor, agreed to let him make the attempt. Alexander walked slowly toward the horse, speaking to it in low, soothing tones. But instead of approaching from the front, as the others had done, he circled around to observe the animal from different angles. What he noticed changed everything. The horse was not mad or vicious. It was afraid of its own shadow. Each time the dark shape moved on the ground, the stallion would rear in terror, striking out at what it perceived as a threatening presence. With the kind of insight that would later make him one of history's greatest military tacticians, Alexander identified the core of the problem and devised an elegant solution. He took hold of the stallion's bridle and turned the horse toward the sun so that its shadow fell behind it, invisible to the frightened animal. Almost immediately, the horse calmed. Alexander was then able to mount the stallion and ride it around the courtyard, to the amazement of all who watched. Philip is said to have wept with pride at this demonstration of his son's capabilities. According to the historian Plutarch, the king declared, "My boy, you must find a kingdom big enough for your ambitions. Macedonia is too small for you." These words proved prophetic, for Macedonia would indeed prove far too small to contain Alexander's ambitions. The horse became Alexander's constant companion and was named Bucephalus, meaning ox head, after the distinctive white marking on its forehead. The stallion would carry Alexander through many of his greatest victories, becoming as legendary as its master. The bond between horse and rider seemed to symbolize something essential about Alexander's character: his ability to see solutions where others saw only problems, his willingness to approach challenges from unexpected angles, and his natural affinity for the kind of bold action that lesser men would never dare attempt. This incident, at age 12, revealed the fundamental qualities that would define Alexander's approach to every challenge he would face in his remarkable life. He possessed the intellectual capacity to analyze complex problems, the creativity to devise innovative solutions, and the courage to act on his convictions, even when conventional wisdom suggested caution. More than that, he had the kind of natural authority that made others want to follow him, even when his plans seemed impossible. The years following the Bucephalus incident were marked by increasing recognition of Alexander's exceptional abilities. Philip began including his son in military councils, seeking his opinions on matters of strategy and tactics. The boy's insights often surprised seasoned generals, demonstrating a natural understanding of warfare that complemented his formal education. Alexander studied the great military campaigns of the past, learning from the successes and failures of legendary commanders like Cyrus the Great and Xenophon. But it was not just military matters that occupied Alexander's attention. He showed a genuine interest in the customs and cultures of the various peoples that made up Philip's expanding kingdom. Macedonia itself was a melting pot of Greek, Illyrian, Thracian, and other influences, and Alexander seemed instinctively to understand that successful rule required more than just military dominance. It required the ability to unite diverse peoples under a common vision. As Alexander approached his 13th birthday, it became clear that his education would need to advance to a new level. Philip had transformed Macedonia into the dominant power in northern Greece, but he harbored even grander ambitions. If his son was to inherit and expand upon these achievements, he would need tutoring from someone capable of preparing him for the enormous challenges that lay ahead. The choice of a tutor for the young prince would prove to be one of the most consequential decisions in ancient history. Philip could have selected any number of distinguished scholars, military theorists, or political philosophers. Instead, he chose a man whose influence on Alexander would help shape the course of Western civilization, a brilliant philosopher from Stagira named Aristotle. The stage was set for one of history's most famous teacher-student relationship, one that would combine the practical wisdom of a master philosopher with the boundless ambition of a future world conqueror. As Alexander prepared to begin his formal education under Aristotle's guidance, the foundations were already in place for the extraordinary achievements that would follow. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus at 12 would soon be ready to tame the world. Part 2. The Student of the Greatest Mind. Aristotle shapes a future world conqueror. At the age of 13, Alexander's life took a dramatic turn that would influence not only his own destiny, but the fate of the entire ancient world. Philip II had decided that his son's education required the guidance of the most brilliant mind of the age, and he had succeeded in securing the services of Aristotle, the former student of Plato and perhaps the greatest philosopher who ever lived. The choice was both audacious and inspired. Audacious because Aristotle commanded fees that would have bankrupted lesser kingdoms, and inspired because no other teacher could have provided the intellectual foundation necessary for the unprecedented challenges that lay ahead. The arrangement Philip negotiated with Aristotle was extraordinary in its scope and generosity. In exchange for tutoring Alexander and a select group of young Macedonian nobles, Philip agreed to rebuild Aristotle's hometown of Stagira, which had been destroyed in an earlier war. More than mere financial compensation, This was an investment in the future of Macedonia and, unknowingly, the entire Hellenistic world. Philip understood that military conquest alone could not sustain an empire. Lasting power required the kind of intellectual sophistication that only the finest education could provide. The location chosen for Alexander's education was equally symbolic and practical. Rather than confining the lessons to the palace at Pella, with its distractions and political intrigues, Philip established a private academy in the sacred precinct of the nymphs at Mysa, about 20 miles from the capital. This secluded sanctuary, surrounded by ancient groves and natural springs, provided the perfect environment for intensive study and philosophical reflection. The choice of location reflected Philip's understanding that his son's education needed to be comprehensive, not just military and political, but spiritual and intellectual as well. Aristotle was 42 years old when he accepted the responsibility of educating the 13-year-old Alexander. He was at the height of his intellectual powers, having spent 20 years at Plato's Academy in Athens before establishing his own philosophical school. His approach to education was revolutionary for its time, emphasizing empirical observation and practical application rather than the pure theoretical speculation favored by his teacher Plato. This methodology would prove perfectly suited to Alexander's temperament, combining the future conqueror's natural curiosity with rigorous analytical thinking. The curriculum Aristotle designed for Alexander was breathtaking in its scope and depth. The core subjects included rhetoric and literature, ethics and politics, natural science and medicine, mathematics and logic. But Aristotle went far beyond these traditional areas of study, introducing Alexander to geography and ethnography, military strategy and statecraft, psychology and the arts of persuasion. Every lesson was designed not merely to impart knowledge, but to develop the critical thinking skills that would be essential for governing a vast and diverse empire. Literature formed the foundation of Alexander's education, and it was here that Aristotle made perhaps his most lasting impact on his famous student. The philosopher prepared a special edition of Homer's Iliad, annotating the text with his own insights and commentary. This book became Alexander's most treasured possession, a companion that would travel with him to the ends of the known world. Years later, during his campaigns in Asia, Alexander would keep this annotated Iliad under his pillow, studying it by lamplight in his tent, and finding in Achilles a model for his own heroic aspirations. The impact of Homer's epic on Alexander's character cannot be overstated. In Achilles, he found the template for the kind of life he wanted to live, short perhaps, but blazing with glory and achievement. Achilles' famous choice between a long, obscure life and a brief, glorious one resonated deeply with the young prince. Alexander internalized the hero's willingness to sacrifice everything for immortal fame, a philosophy that would drive him to attempt the impossible throughout his career. But Aristotle was careful to balance this romantic heroism with practical wisdom. He taught Alexander that true leadership required more than courage and charisma. It demanded intellectual rigor, strategic thinking, and the ability to understand and motivate diverse groups of people. The philosopher's lessons in ethics emphasized the importance of justice and moderation, virtues that would serve Alexander well when he later ruled over conquered populations with different customs and beliefs. One of Aristotle's most important contributions to Alexander's education was his teaching about the natural world. The philosopher's systematic approach to biology, geography, and medicine gave Alexander a scientific understanding of the world that was far ahead of his time. This knowledge would prove invaluable during his later campaigns, enabling him to adapt his tactics to different climates and terrains, to understand the medical challenges of campaigning in distant lands, and to appreciate the diversity of human cultures he would encounter.
Aristotle's political philosophy also had a profound impact on Alexander's worldview. The philosopher taught that the highest form of government was one that balanced the interests of different social groups while maintaining overall unity of purpose. This lesson influenced Alexander's later policies toward conquered peoples, leading him to adopt a remarkably inclusive approach to empire building that preserved local customs while establishing Macedonian authority. During these formative years at 𝔦𝔫𝔻, Alexander was not the only student benefiting from Aristotle's wisdom. The philosopher also taught a carefully selected group of young Macedonian nobles who would later become Alexander's most trusted generals and administrators. This group included Hephaestion, who became Alexander's closest friend and perhaps the love of his life; Ptolemy, who would later found the dynasty that ruled Egypt for 3 centuries; Cassander, who would play a controversial role in the years following Alexander's death, and many others who would help shape the Hellenistic world.
The bonds formed during these 3 years at 𝔦𝔫𝔻 proved to be among the most important relationships in Alexander's life. Under Aristotle's guidance, these young men developed not just individual excellence, but a sense of shared purpose and mutual loyalty that would sustain them through the incredible challenges that lay ahead. They learned to think together, to challenge each other intellectually, and to coordinate their efforts in pursuit of common goals. Aristotle's teaching methods were as innovative as his curriculum. Rather than relying on rote memorization or passive absorption of information, he encouraged active debate and discussion. He challenged his students to question assumptions, to examine evidence critically, and to develop their own reasoned conclusions. This approach perfectly suited Alexander's inquisitive nature and helped develop the intellectual independence that would later enable him to devise revolutionary solutions to military and political problems. The philosopher also emphasized the importance of physical fitness and military training, understanding that Alexander's future would likely involve extensive campaigning. The prince's education included intensive training in swordsmanship, horsemanship, and the tactical deployment of different types of troops. But Aristotle ensured that this military training was always subordinated to intellectual and moral development. Alexander learned to see warfare not as an end in itself, but as a tool for achieving larger political and cultural objectives. One of the most significant aspects of Aristotle's influence on Alexander was his teaching about the relationship between Greeks and barbarians, the term Greeks used for all non-Greek peoples. While many Greeks of the time viewed barbarians as inherently inferior, Aristotle taught a more nuanced view. He acknowledged that different peoples had different strengths and capabilities, and he encouraged Alexander to study and understand foreign cultures rather than simply dismiss them as primitive. This lesson would prove crucial to Alexander's later success as a conqueror. Unlike many military leaders who sought simply to impose their will on defeated enemies, Alexander showed a remarkable ability to appreciate and adapt to local customs and traditions. His willingness to adopt Persian court ceremonies, to marry into local royal families, and to incorporate foreign soldiers into his army reflected the intellectual flexibility that Aristotle had helped to develop. The philosopher also taught Alexander about the importance of founding cities as centers of civilization and culture. Aristotle believed that the highest human achievements were possible only in properly organized urban communities, where commerce, arts, and learning could flourish. This lesson influenced Alexander's practice of establishing new cities throughout his conquered territories,
spreading Greek culture while providing focal points for economic and intellectual development. Perhaps most importantly, Aristotle taught Alexander to think systematically about the challenges of governing a large and diverse empire. The philosopher's analysis of different constitutional forms, his study of successful and failed states, and his insights into human psychology provided Alexander with the intellectual framework he would need to manage the unprecedented political challenges that awaited him. As Alexander approached his 16th birthday, his formal education under Aristotle was drawing to a close. The 3 years at 𝔦𝔫𝔻 had transformed the promising but untested prince into a young man of extraordinary intellectual sophistication and practical capability. He had mastered the accumulated wisdom of Greek civilization while developing the critical thinking skills necessary to go beyond traditional limitations.
The relationship between teacher and student had evolved into something approaching intellectual partnership. Aristotle recognized that Alexander possessed not just exceptional intelligence, but the kind of creative vision that could reshape the world. For his part, Alexander had absorbed not just specific knowledge, but an approach to learning and problem-solving that would serve him throughout his career. One of Aristotle's most quoted principles became a guiding philosophy for Alexander's entire life. There is only one way to avoid criticism: do nothing, say nothing, and be nothing. Alexander took this lesson to heart, choosing action over safety, bold innovation over cautious tradition, and the pursuit of greatness over the comfort of mediocrity. This willingness to risk everything in pursuit of extraordinary achievement became the defining characteristic of his personality. Another crucial lesson concerned the nature of leadership itself. Aristotle taught that true authority came not from force alone, but from the ability to inspire others to achieve more than they thought possible. A great leader, according to the philosopher, was one who could unite diverse groups of people around a common vision and motivate them to extraordinary efforts in pursuit of shared goals. This understanding would prove essential when Alexander later found himself commanding armies composed of Macedonians, Greeks, Thracians, Persians, Indians, and dozens of other nationalities. As the time approached for Alexander to leave 𝔦𝔫𝔻 and return to the world of practical politics and military campaigns, both teacher and student understood that they had participated in something historically significant. Aristotle had provided the intellectual foundation for what would become the greatest conquests in human history, while Alexander had demonstrated the kind of genius that could transform philosophical principles into world-changing action. The impact of these 3 years would extend far beyond Alexander's personal development. The ideas and methods that Aristotle taught at 𝔦𝔫𝔻 would be carried to the ends of the known world by Alexander and his companions, influencing the development of Hellenistic civilization and ultimately contributing to the intellectual foundations of Western culture. The synthesis of Greek philosophy, practical politics, and military innovation that emerged from this unique educational experiment would reshape the ancient world and establish patterns of thought and governance that persist to this day. When Alexander finally departed from 𝔦𝔫𝔻 at age 16, he carried with him not just specific knowledge, but a way of thinking about the world that would enable him to achieve the impossible. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus had been transformed into a young man capable of taming nations and cultures, of bridging the gap between the East and West, and of creating an empire that would endure long after his own brief but brilliant life had ended. Part 3. The Boy Who Commanded Men.
a teenager's first taste of power and blood. The summer of 340 BC marked a pivotal transformation in the life of Alexander, as his father, Philip II, made a decision that would thrust the 16-year-old prince into the brutal realities of statecraft and warfare. While Philip prepared to campaign against the rebellious city of Perinthus on the Sea of Marmara, he faced a dilemma that confronted every monarch of his era. Who could be trusted to govern Macedonia in his absence? The answer Philip chose would have seemed audacious to any other king of the ancient world. He appointed his teenage son as regent of the kingdom. This appointment was unprecedented in its scope and implications. At an age when most young men were still learning their letters or mastering basic military formations, Alexander was given authority over the entire Macedonian state. He commanded the royal treasury, controlled the administrative apparatus, and held the power of life and death over the kingdom's subjects. More significantly, he was responsible for Macedonia's military defense during a period when the kingdom faced threats from hostile tribes along its northern and western borders. The decision reflected Philip's extraordinary confidence in his son's abilities, but it also represented a calculated risk. Macedonia's enemies would certainly view a 16-year-old regent as a sign of weakness, an opportunity to test the kingdom's defenses, and perhaps seize territory that had been conquered at great cost. Philip understood this danger, but he also recognized that Alexander needed real experience in command if he was to fulfill his destiny as a world conqueror. The first test of Alexander's leadership came sooner than anyone expected. The 𝔬𝕝, a Thracian tribe that inhabited the mountainous regions north of Macedonia, had been watching for signs of Macedonian weakness ever since Philip departed for his campaign. These fierce warriors had never fully accepted Macedonian suzerainty, and they saw the appointment of a teenage regent as the perfect opportunity to reassert their independence. In the late summer of 340 BC, the 𝔬𝕝 launched a coordinated uprising, attacking Macedonian outposts and threatening to sweep down into the fertile plains where Macedonia's wealth was concentrated. The news of the rebellion reached Pella just as Alexander was settling into his new responsibilities as regent. For many 16-year-olds, such a crisis would have been paralyzing, the weight of an entire kingdom's fate resting on untested shoulders. But Alexander's reaction was characteristically bold and immediate. Rather than waiting for his father's return or seeking the advice of older advisors, he made the decision that would define his approach to every challenge for the rest of his life. He would meet the threat head-on.
Alexander's first act as a military commander demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that would later revolutionize warfare. Instead of simply reacting to the 𝔬𝕝 rebellion, he recognized it as an opportunity to establish his own reputation as a leader and to secure Macedonia's northern frontier permanently. He assembled an army composed primarily of young Macedonian soldiers eager to prove themselves under their prince's leadership, supplemented by veteran officers who could provide tactical advice if needed. The campaign against the 𝔬𝕝 became Alexander's introduction to the harsh realities of ancient warfare. Unlike the theoretical discussions of military strategy he had engaged in with Aristotle, this was a matter of life and death for hundreds of men under his command. The responsibility weighed heavily on the young prince, but it also excited him in ways that peaceful governance never could. This was what he had been born for. Not the administration of laws and taxes, but the kind of direct action that could reshape the world through the application of will and intelligence. Alexander's approach to the 𝔦𝕝 campaign revealed several characteristics that would define his later conquests. First, he moved with a speed that caught his enemies completely off guard. While the 𝔦𝕝 expected a prolonged mobilization period that would give them time to consolidate their positions, Alexander struck within days of receiving news of the rebellion. His rapid advance prevented the various 𝔦𝕝 chieftains from coordinating their efforts and forced them to fight as isolated bands rather than a unified army. Second, Alexander demonstrated the kind of tactical innovation that would make him legendary. Rather than following conventional military doctrine, which called for direct frontal assaults against fortified positions, he employed a combination of deception, flanking maneuvers, and psychological warfare that left his enemies confused and demoralized. The young prince seemed to possess an intuitive understanding of how to exploit his opponent's weaknesses while maximizing his own advantages. The climactic battle of the 𝔦𝕝 campaign took place in a narrow mountain valley where the terrain seemed to favor the defenders. The 𝔦𝕝 warriors, confident in their knowledge of the local geography, had positioned themselves in what appeared to be an impregnable position overlooking the only approach route. A conventional commander might have attempted a costly frontal assault or perhaps retreated to seek a more favorable battleground. Alexander chose a third option that demonstrated his willingness to take calculated risks in pursuit of decisive victory. Under cover of darkness, Alexander led a select force of his most trusted soldiers on a treacherous climb through terrain that the 𝔦𝕝 considered impassable. The night march was exhausting and dangerous, requiring the Macedonians to navigate steep cliffs and loose rock faces while carrying their weapons and equipment. Several men fell to their deaths, and others were injured by falling stones. But Alexander's gamble paid off when his force emerged at dawn behind the 𝔦𝕝 positions, completely reversing the tactical situation. The battle that followed was brief but decisive. Caught between Alexander's flanking force and the main Macedonian army advancing up the valley, the 𝔦𝕝 warriors found themselves in an impossible position. Some attempted to fight their way out, but most simply fled into the mountains, abandoning their weapons and their plans for independence. Alexander's victory was complete, but more importantly, it established his reputation as a commander who could succeed where others would fail. The aftermath of the 𝔦𝕝 campaign revealed another aspect of Alexander's character that would prove crucial to his later success: his approach to conquered peoples. Rather than following the conventional practice of enslaving the defeated population or imposing punitive tribute, Alexander chose a more sophisticated strategy. He offered the 𝔦𝕝 chieftains the opportunity to become allies rather than subjects, incorporating their warriors into his own forces and respecting their traditional customs as long as they acknowledged Macedonian authority. This policy reflected the influence of Aristotle's teachings about the importance of understanding and adapting to different cultures. But it also demonstrated Alexander's practical intelligence. He recognized that the loyalty of conquered peoples could be more valuable than their immediate submission. The 𝔦𝕝 warriors who joined Alexander's army would later serve with distinction in his campaigns against the Persian Empire, their mountain fighting skills proving invaluable in the difficult terrain of Afghanistan and Central Asia. Having successfully concluded his first independent military campaign, Alexander established his first city. Following the example of his father, who had founded several settlements to secure conquered territory, the 16-year-old prince established a fortified town at a strategic location in the former 𝔦𝕝 territory. The settlement was named Alexandropolis, the first of many cities that would bear the young conqueror's name. This act revealed Alexander's understanding that military conquest was only the first step in building lasting political control.
Real security required the establishment of permanent settlements that could serve as administrative centers and military bases. The founding of Alexandropolis at such a young age demonstrated Alexander's confidence in his own destiny. Most teenagers might have been content with the glory of military victory, but Alexander was already thinking in terms of permanent legacy. The city he established would serve as a monument to his achievements long after the immediate crisis had been forgotten. More importantly, it showed his subjects and enemies alike that this was no ordinary prince. This was someone who thought and acted like a king even before he had inherited the throne. When Philip returned from his campaign against Perinthus, he found Macedonia not only secure but actually strengthened by his son's actions. The successful suppression of the Mydai rebellion had eliminated a persistent threat to the kingdom's northern frontier, while Alexander's diplomatic handling of the defeated population had actually increased Macedonians' military resources. The establishment of Alexandropolis provided a permanent base for future operations in the region, ensuring that the Mydai would never again pose a serious threat to Macedonian security.
Philip's reaction to his son's achievements revealed both pride and perhaps a touch of concern. The king had expected Alexander to handle the responsibilities of regency competently, but the young prince had exceeded all expectations. At 16, Alexander had demonstrated not just military competence, but the kind of strategic vision that marked truly great commanders. Philip began to realize that his son possessed capabilities that might eventually surpass his own, a realization that was both gratifying and slightly unsettling for a man who had devoted his life to expanding Macedonian power. The success of Alexander's regency also had important implications for his relationship with the Macedonian nobility and military establishment. Many of the kingdom's most important families had initially been skeptical about placing their interests in the hands of a teenager, regardless of his royal bloodline. Alexander's decisive handling of the Mydai crisis silenced most of these doubts and established his credibility as a future leader. The young officers who had served under him during the campaign became the nucleus of a personal following that would prove crucial in the years to come. As 340 BC drew to a close, Alexander had accomplished something remarkable for someone of any age, let alone a 16-year-old. He had successfully governed one of the most powerful kingdoms in the Greek world, suppressed a serious rebellion, expanded Macedonian territory, and established his first city. More importantly, he had proven to himself and others that he possessed the qualities necessary for independent command. The boy who had tamed Bucephalus had demonstrated that he could also tame rebellious tribes and hostile territories. But Alexander's achievements as regent were only the beginning of his rise to power. As he returned to his studies and preparations for greater challenges ahead, both father and son understood that the kingdom of Macedonia would not be sufficient to contain the young prince's ambitions. Philip had created the most formidable military machine in the Greek world, but it would take Alexander's genius to unleash its full potential against the vast Persian Empire that dominated the East. The lessons Alexander learned during his regency would prove invaluable throughout his later career. The experience of wielding absolute authority, of making decisions that affected thousands of lives, of balancing military necessity with political wisdom, all of these skills would be tested on an incomparably larger scale when he began his conquest of the known world. The teenager who had successfully governed Macedonia and defeated the Mydai was being forged into the young man who would challenge the greatest empire in human history. As 349 BC began, Alexander stood at the threshold of even greater challenges and opportunities. Philip's plans for the conquest of Greece were nearing fruition, and the young prince would soon have the chance to prove himself on an even larger stage. The boy who had commanded men at 16 was about to become the teenager who would help his father reshape the balance of power in the ancient world.
Part 4. Fire and Fury. The Destroyer of Thebes. A 22-year-old's lesson in terror. The autumn of 338 BC brought with it the most significant test of Alexander's military prowess to that point in his young life. At 18, he would stand alongside his father, Philip II, on the battlefield of Chaeronea, where the combined forces of Athens and Thebes would make their final desperate stand against Macedonian hegemony. This battle would not only determine the future of Greece, but would also mark Alexander's emergence as a military commander of extraordinary capability, even as his father's assassination 2 years later would thrust him into a position where those capabilities would be tested to their absolute limits. The politics leading up to Chaeronea were Byzantine in their complexity, reflecting the death throes of the old Greek city-state system. For decades, Philip had been systematically undermining the independence of the southern Greek polis through a combination of military pressure, diplomatic intrigue, and economic manipulation. His ultimate goal was nothing less than the unification of all Greece under Macedonian leadership, creating a power base sufficient to launch the great crusade against Persia that had been his dream since youth. The catalyst for the final confrontation came through Philip's intervention in the Sacred War, a conflict that had been ravaging central Greece for years. The Amphictyonic League, the religious organization that controlled the sacred site of Delphi, had been torn apart by competing factions, each seeking to use religious authority for political advantage. Philip saw in this chaos an opportunity to present himself as the defender of traditional Greek religious values while simultaneously advancing his own strategic objectives. When Philip's forces moved to support the Amphictyonic League against the Phocians, who had been accused of sacrilege for seizing control of Delphi, Athens and Thebes finally recognized the existential threat that Macedonia posed to their independence. Demosthenes, the greatest orator of his age, had been warning the Athenians for years about Philip's intentions, delivering his famous Philippics in a desperate attempt to awaken his fellow citizens to the danger of their situation. Now, with Macedonian forces controlling central Greece and threatening to march on Athens itself, even the most complacent Athenians could no longer ignore the reality of their situation. The alliance between Athens and Thebes represented a remarkable diplomatic achievement, considering the centuries of rivalry and mutual hostility between the two cities. These were the poli that had contested for supremacy in the Peloponnesian War, that had alternately dominated and been dominated by each other throughout the classical period. Only the prospect of complete subjugation to a barbarian power from the north could have driven them to cooperate in their own defense.
Alexander's role in the campaign that followed revealed both his tactical brilliance and his growing confidence as an independent military commander. Philip assigned his 18-year-old son command of the companion cavalry, the elite heavy cavalry force that formed the striking arm of the Macedonian army. This was an enormous responsibility for someone of any age, let alone a teenager, but Philip recognized that Alexander had already demonstrated his competence during the Mede campaign in his regency. The companion cavalry was no ordinary military unit. These were the sons of Macedonian nobility, men who had been trained from childhood in the arts of war and horsemanship. They rode the finest horses, carried the best weapons, and considered themselves the equals of any warriors in the world. For them to accept the leadership of an 18-year-old, even a royal prince, required not just respect for his bloodline, but genuine confidence in his military abilities. The Battle of Chaeronea, fought on August 2, 338 BC, would become one of the most studied engagements in military history. The tactical situation favored the defenders, who occupied strong positions on high ground and outnumbered the Macedonians by a significant margin. The combined Athenian and Theban force numbered approximately 35,000 men, while Philip commanded perhaps 30,000 Macedonians and allied troops. More importantly, the Greeks were fighting for their independence on their own soil, which typically provided a significant advantage in terms of morale and determination.
Philip's battle plan revealed the sophisticated tactical thinking that had made Macedonia the dominant power in northern Greece. Rather than attempting a frontal assault against the Greek positions, he devised a complex maneuver designed to draw the enemy forces out of their defensive positions and create opportunities for decisive cavalry attacks. The key to this plan was Alexander's companion cavalry, which would need to exploit any gaps that developed in the enemy line with perfect timing and overwhelming force. The battle began at dawn with Philip's phalanx advancing against the Athenian left wing in what appeared to be a conventional frontal assault. The Athenians, commanded by experienced generals and fighting for their city's survival, met this attack with fierce resistance. The clash of bronze-tipped spears against bronze-faced shields created a sound that witnesses compared to thunder rolling across the battlefield. For hours, the two lines swayed back and forth, neither side able to gain a decisive advantage.
But Philip's apparent frontal assault was actually a carefully orchestrated deception. As the Athenians pressed forward to meet what they believed was the main Macedonian attack, Philip gradually withdrew his right wing, creating the impression that his forces were beginning to give ground. The Athenians, sensing victory, pressed their attack more aggressively, extending their line and creating exactly the kind of gap that Philip had been hoping to exploit. The moment that would define Alexander's military reputation came when the Theban sacred band, the elite force of 300 paired warriors who had never been defeated in battle, advanced to support the Athenian attack. These warriors, bound together by bonds of love as well as military discipline, represented the finest military tradition of classical Greece. Their advance created the opportunity Philip had been waiting for, but it was Alexander who seized that opportunity with devastating effectiveness. Leading the companion cavalry in a thunderous charge that shook the earth, 18-year-old Alexander struck the exposed flank of the advancing Greeks with a violence that shattered their formation completely. The impact of 2,000 heavily armored horsemen hitting the Greek line was catastrophic, but it was Alexander's tactical instincts that transformed a successful cavalry charge into a complete rout of the enemy forces. Instead of following the conventional practice of pursuing scattered individual enemies, Alexander kept his cavalry together and used their mobility to roll up the entire Greek line from the flank. Each successive unit of Greek infantry found itself attacked from the side while still engaged to their front, making organized resistance impossible. Within minutes, the disciplined formations that had held the Macedonian phalanx at bay dissolved into chaos. The destruction of the sacred band became the symbol of Greek resistance dying at 𝔸𝔠𝔠. These warriors, who had sworn never to retreat and never to surrender, fought to the last man rather than accept defeat. When the battle was over, all 300 members of the sacred band lay dead on the field, their bodies arranged in the formation they had maintained until the end. Even Philip wept when he saw their sacrifice, ordering that a monument be erected to honor their courage. The aftermath of 𝔸𝔠𝔠 revealed the magnitude of the transformation that had taken place in the Greek world. In a single day, the independence that the city-states had cherished for centuries had been extinguished. Athens and Thebes, the greatest powers in classical Greece, were forced to accept Macedonian hegemony. The victory established Philip as the undisputed master of the Greek world and positioned Macedonia to launch the great campaign against Persia that had been the king's ultimate objective.
For Alexander, 𝔸𝔠𝔠𝔰 represented more than just military victory. It was his coming of age as a commander and a recognition of his place in his father's grand strategy. The 18-year-old prince had not only proven his tactical competence, but had demonstrated the kind of battlefield leadership that inspired absolute loyalty from his men. The companion cavalry who had followed him in that decisive charge would form the core of the army that would later conquer the Persian Empire. Philip's treatment of the defeated Greeks after 𝔸𝔠𝔠𝔰 revealed the sophisticated political thinking that made him more than just a successful warlord.
Rather than imposing harsh terms that would have created permanent resentment, he offered the Greek cities remarkably generous conditions for their submission. Athens was allowed to maintain its democratic government and even its navy, while Thebes was treated with similar leniency. This magnanimity was not weakness, but calculated policy. Philip understood that he would need Greek cooperation for his planned campaign against Persia. The establishment of the League of Corinth in 337 BC formalized Philip's control over Greece while maintaining the fiction of voluntary cooperation. This organization, which included representatives from all the major Greek cities except Sparta, provided the legal framework for the joint Greek-Macedonian expedition against Persia. Alexander attended these negotiations as his father's principal representative, gaining valuable experience in the diplomatic skills that would later prove essential to governing a vast multicultural empire. But even as Philip consolidated his control over Greece and prepared for the great campaign in the east, forces were gathering that would dramatically alter the trajectory of both Macedonian and world history. The king's polygamous marriage practices, a common feature of Macedonian royal politics, created tensions within the royal family that would have devastating consequences. Philip's decision to take a seventh wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, a young Macedonian noblewoman, threatened the position of Alexander's mother Olympias and, by extension, Alexander's own claim to the succession. The political crisis that developed around Philip's marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice revealed the precarious nature of royal authority even in a kingdom as powerful as Macedonia. Olympias, never one to accept challenges to her position quietly, began organizing opposition to the new marriage and its potential implications for her son's future. The resulting court intrigue created factions within the Macedonian nobility that threatened to tear the kingdom apart just as it stood on the threshold of its greatest triumph. Alexander found himself caught in the middle of this family crisis, forced to navigate between his loyalty to his father and his obligation to defend his mother's honor and his own inheritance rights. The young prince's position was complicated by the fact that his military reputation and popular support made him a potential threat to Philip's authority, regardless of his personal intentions. The king began to view his son with increasing suspicion, while Alexander struggled to maintain his father's trust without abandoning his own legitimate interests. The tension between father and son reached a climactic moment at the wedding feast celebrating Philip's marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice in 336 BC. During the celebration, Attalus, the bride's uncle and one of Philip's leading generals, made a toast calling on the gods to grant Philip a legitimate heir from his new marriage. The implication that Alexander was somehow illegitimate because of his mother's Epirite origins was intolerable to the young prince.
Alexander's reaction was swift and violent. Rising from his place at the royal table, he hurled his wine cup at Attalus and demanded satisfaction for the insult. Philip, already drunk and perhaps seeing this as an opportunity to assert his authority over his increasingly independent son, drew his sword and advanced on Alexander. But the king had consumed too much wine and stumbled, falling heavily to the floor in full view of the assembled Macedonian nobility. The sight of the mighty Philip sprawling helplessly while his teenage son stood over him became a defining moment in their relationship. Alexander's response revealed both his quick wit and his understanding of political theater. Here is the man who was preparing to cross from Europe to Asia, and he cannot even cross from one couch to another. This devastating comment not only humiliated Philip, but also called into question his fitness to lead the great expedition against Persia. Following this confrontation, Alexander and Olympias were forced into exile, seeking refuge with Olympias's relatives in Epirus. For several months, it appeared that Alexander's career as a future world conqueror might be over before it had truly begun.
Philip began making arrangements for the succession that seemed to minimize Alexander's role, while various Macedonian nobles positioned themselves to benefit from the apparent breach between the king and his heir. But Philip was too astute a politician to allow the breach with Alexander to become permanent. The king recognized that his son's military abilities and popularity with the army made him indispensable to Macedonian success. More importantly, Philip understood that the upcoming Persian campaign would require the kind of leadership that only Alexander seemed capable of providing. Gradually, through intermediaries and careful diplomacy, father and son were reconciled, though their relationship remained strained. The reconciliation was formalized at the wedding of Alexander's sister Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus in 336 BC. This marriage was intended to strengthen the alliance between Macedonia and Epirus while demonstrating the unity of the royal family. Philip spared no expense in making the ceremony a magnificent display of Macedonian power and wealth, inviting representatives from across the Greek world to witness the kingdom's glory. But this celebration of Macedonian triumph would become, instead, the scene of one of history's most consequential assassinations. On the morning of the wedding ceremony, as Philip entered the theater where the festivities were being held, a young Macedonian nobleman named Pausanias stepped forward and plunged a dagger into the king's chest. Philip collapsed and died within minutes, his blood staining the ground where he had planned to celebrate his family's happiness.
Part 5. Crossing the Rubicon of Asia. 334 BC. A 22-year-old declares war on the world's greatest empire. The assassination of Philip II in 336 BC thrust 20-year-old Alexander into a position that would have overwhelmed most experienced rulers. Within hours of his father's death, the young prince faced challenges that threatened not only his personal survival, but the very existence of the Macedonian kingdom. The Greek city-states, sensing opportunity in the chaos of royal succession, began preparing for rebellion. The northern barbarian tribes that Philip had subdued started massing their forces for invasions. Most dangerously, rival claimants to the Macedonian throne emerged from among the nobility, each backed by powerful factions that saw Alexander's youth as a fatal weakness. Alexander's response to these multiple crises revealed the extraordinary qualities that would define his reign. Rather than retreating to consolidate his position or seeking accommodation with his enemies, the 20-year-old king chose immediate and decisive action. His first priority was securing the loyalty of the Macedonian army, the instrument upon which all his future plans depended. Alexander understood that in a kingdom where power ultimately flowed from military success, the soldiers' acceptance of his leadership was more important than any legal claim to succession. The young king's address to the assembled Macedonian troops became legendary for its combination of emotional appeal and strategic vision. Standing before thousands of battle-hardened veterans who had followed Philip through decades of conquest, Alexander acknowledged his youth while simultaneously asserting his divine destiny. "I am indebted to my father for living, but to my teacher for living well," he declared, crediting both Philip's military legacy and Aristotle's wisdom, while making it clear that he intended to surpass both influences through his own achievements. The army's response exceeded Alexander's most optimistic expectations. These men who had witnessed his courage at Chaeronea and his competence during the Maedi campaign saw in the young king not a liability, but an opportunity. They recognized that Alexander possessed something that even Philip had lacked: a vision that extended beyond the conquest of Greece to the transformation of the entire known world. The soldiers who acclaimed Alexander as their king were not just accepting a new commander, they were signing on for the greatest adventure in human history. With the army's loyalty secured, Alexander moved to eliminate potential rivals with ruthless efficiency. The speed and thoroughness of these actions shocked even his supporters, revealing a capacity for political violence that seemed inconsistent with his youth and philosophical education. Yet Alexander understood that mercy toward his enemies would be interpreted as weakness, potentially encouraging further challenges to his authority. In the brutal world of Macedonian politics, survival often depended on the willingness to strike first and strike decisively. The most significant of these eliminations was that of Attalus, the general whose insulting toast at Philip's wedding had precipitated the family crisis. Attalus commanded an advance force that Philip had already sent into Asia Minor to prepare for the Persian campaign. His military position and family connections made him a potential focal point for opposition to Alexander's rule. Rather than risk a civil war, Alexander had Attalus assassinated, sending a clear message that he would tolerate no challenges to his authority, regardless of the challenger's previous service to Macedonia. These decisive actions in the first months of his reign established Alexander's reputation as a ruler who combined strategic thinking with absolute determination. By his 21st birthday, he had not only survived the succession crisis, but had actually strengthened his position relative to potential rivals. The Greek cities that had planned rebellion found themselves facing a king who seemed even more formidable than his father, while the northern tribes discovered that Alexander's youth did not translate into weakness or indecision. However, the most serious test of Alexander's authority came from an unexpected source. The city of Thebes, which had accepted Philip's hegemony after Cheronea, chose to interpret the young king's accession as an opportunity to regain its independence. Encouraged by promises of support from Athens and perhaps Persia, the Thebans expelled the Macedonian garrison from their citadel and declared their freedom from Macedonian control. This rebellion represented more than just a local challenge. It was a direct test of whether Alexander could maintain the Greek confederation that his father had created. Alexander's response to the Theban rebellion became one of the defining moments of his early reign. Rather than negotiating or attempting to isolate Thebes diplomatically, the 22-year-old king chose to make an example that would deter any other Greek city from challenging Macedonian authority. His decision to destroy Thebes completely was calculated to demonstrate that the new king was, if anything, more dangerous than his predecessor. The siege of Thebes in 335 BC lasted only 2 weeks, but its consequences would echo throughout the ancient world for centuries. Alexander's army invested the city with a professionalism that reflected years of Philip's military reforms. But the young king's personal leadership transformed what might have been a routine siege into a demonstration of tactical brilliance. When the Thebans attempted to break the siege through a desperate sortie, Alexander was waiting with a perfectly coordinated response that turned their attack into a catastrophic defeat.
The fall of Thebes was followed by scenes of destruction that shocked even Alexander's own soldiers. The young king ordered the complete demolition of the city, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. 6,000 Thebans died in the sack, while 30,000 survivors were sold into slavery.
The systematic nature of this destruction was intended to send a message that would be heard from Athens to Babylon. Alexander of Macedon was not to be underestimated because of his youth. Standing in the ruins of what had once been one of Greece's most powerful cities, Alexander delivered words that would become one of his most famous quotes: "Nothing is impossible to him who will try." This statement encapsulated the philosophy that would drive his entire career: the belief that human limitations were merely obstacles to be overcome through sufficient determination and intelligence. The 22-year-old who spoke these words had just demonstrated their truth through the annihilation of a city that had considered itself invincible. The destruction of Thebes achieved Alexander's immediate objective of deterring Greek rebellion, but it also revealed aspects of his character that would become increasingly prominent as his power grew. The young king's willingness to employ extreme violence in pursuit of political objectives showed that his philosophical education had not made him squeamish about the realities of power. Yet his decision to spare Pindar's house demonstrated that he remained conscious of cultural values and the importance of maintaining connections to Greek intellectual tradition. The immediate aftermath of Thebes' destruction saw a complete transformation in the attitude of the Greek city-states toward Macedonian authority. Athens, which had been preparing to support the Theban rebellion, immediately dispatched ambassadors to Alexander with offers of submission and cooperation. Sparta, which had maintained its independence even after Chaeronea, chose to remain silent rather than risk provoking the young king's attention. The message was clear: Alexander had established himself as the undisputed master of Greece through a combination of military competence and calculated brutality. With his authority in Greece secure, Alexander could finally turn his attention to the great enterprise that had consumed his father's final years: the conquest of the Persian Empire. This vast realm, stretching from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River and from the Caspian Sea to the Arabian Gulf, represented the greatest challenge any Greek had ever contemplated. The Persian Empire had ruled much of the known world for over 2 centuries, commanding resources and manpower that dwarfed anything available to the Greek city-states. Yet Alexander approached this seemingly impossible task with the confidence of youth and the strategic insight of genius. At 22, he possessed advantages that older and more experienced commanders might have lacked. His youth meant that he had no preconceived notions about the limitations of military possibility. His philosophical education had taught him to think systematically about complex problems. Most importantly, his recent successes had given him absolute confidence in his own abilities and the loyalty of his army. The planning for the Asian expedition revealed Alexander's sophisticated understanding of the logistical and strategic challenges involved in such an undertaking. Unlike previous Greek expeditions against Persia, which had been essentially glorified raids, Alexander conceived his campaign as a systematic conquest designed to replace Persian rule with Macedonian authority. This vision required not just military victories, but the creation of administrative structures capable of governing diverse populations across vast distances. The army that Alexander assembled for the Persian expedition reflected both Macedonian military excellence and the young king's innovative approach to warfare. The core of the force consisted of approximately 35,000 Macedonians and Greeks, organized according to Philip's tactical innovations but enhanced by Alexander's own modifications. The famous Macedonian phalanx provided the army's backbone,
while the companion cavalry under Alexander's personal command served as its striking force. More significantly, Alexander's expedition included specialists and support personnel that reflected his comprehensive approach to conquest. Engineers and siege specialists would enable the army to reduce fortified positions. Scholars and administrators would help establish effective governance in conquered territories. Most importantly, the expedition included Greek intellectuals who could document the campaign and ensure that Alexander's achievements would be properly recorded for posterity. In the spring of 334 BC, as Alexander prepared to cross the Hellespont and enter Asia for the first time, he was acutely aware that he stood at a historic moment. At 22, he was about to challenge an empire that had dominated the eastern Mediterranean for centuries. The Persian kings could command armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, while Alexander led fewer than 40,000 men. Yet the young Macedonian king possessed something that his enemies lacked: the absolute conviction that he was destined to reshape the world. Alexander's first act upon reaching the Asian shore became symbolic of his entire approach to the Persian campaign. Rather than immediately beginning military operations, he chose to visit Troy, the legendary city where Achilles had won eternal glory through his heroic deeds. This pilgrimage was more than mere romanticism. It was a carefully calculated act of propaganda, designed to present Alexander as the new Achilles, destined to win even greater glory through the conquest of Asia.
The scene at Achilles' tomb became one of the most famous episodes in ancient history. According to tradition, Alexander ran naked around the tomb, following the ancient custom for honoring deceased heroes. He then laid a wreath on the tomb, while his closest friend Hephaestion honored Patroclus, Achilles' beloved companion. This ceremony established the parallel between the legendary heroes of the Trojan War and the new generation of conquerors who would carry Greek arms to the ends of the known world. But Alexander's homage to Achilles involved more than mere imitation. While the legendary hero had won glory through a brief, brilliant career that ended in early death, Alexander intended to surpass his model by achieving not just personal fame, but lasting historical significance. The 22-year-old who stood at Achilles' tomb was already planning conquests that would dwarf anything achieved by the heroes of legend. The psychological impact of Alexander's pilgrimage to Troy extended beyond its effect on his own army. Throughout the Greek world, news of the young king's actions reinforced the perception that this expedition represented more than just another military campaign. Alexander was presenting himself as the heir to the heroic tradition that defined Greek culture, the leader who would finally fulfill the destiny that had been deferred since the time of the Trojan War. As Alexander prepared to advance into the interior of Asia Minor and face his first major test against Persian forces, he carried with him not just the loyalty of his army and the resources of his kingdom, but the accumulated expectations of Greek civilization itself. At 22, he had already demonstrated his ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges through a combination of strategic brilliance, tactical innovation, and sheer force of will. The destruction of Thebes had shown his enemies what awaited those who opposed him, while his pilgrimage to Troy had shown his followers what glory awaited those who served him faithfully. The stage was set for the confrontation that would determine whether Alexander's confidence was justified, or whether the Persian Empire would crush another young Greek adventurer who had overestimated his own capabilities. The next phase of the campaign would test not just Alexander's military skills, but his ability to adapt to the unprecedented challenges of conquering and governing a vast, multicultural empire. At 22, he was about to discover whether his dreams of surpassing Achilles were achievable or merely the fantasies of an ambitious youth who had confused early success with inevitable destiny.
Part 6. The God King of Two Worlds. From Issus to Egypt, a 24-year-old becomes divine. The early months of 334 BC witnessed Alexander's transformation from a promising young king into a military commander whose tactical genius would reshape the ancient world. His first major test came at the Granicus River, where a coalition of Persian satraps had assembled to stop the Macedonian invasion before it could gain momentum. The battle that followed not only secured Alexander's foothold in Asia Minor, but also established his reputation as a leader who fought alongside his men rather than directing them from a safe distance. At the Granicus, 22-year-old Alexander nearly lost his life when a Persian noble's battle axe shattered his helmet, leaving him stunned and vulnerable to a killing blow. Only the quick intervention of his bodyguard, 𝔸𝕝 the Black, who severed the Persian's arm with a single sword stroke, saved the young king's life. This moment of mortal danger, coming so early in the campaign, might have deterred a more cautious commander. Instead, it seemed to reinforce Alexander's belief in his own divine protection and destiny. The victory at Granicus opened all of Western Asia Minor to Macedonian conquest, but Alexander's treatment of the defeated populations revealed strategic thinking that went far beyond mere military success. Rather than following conventional Greek practice by enslaving conquered peoples or imposing harsh tribute, the 22-year-old king offered the Greek cities of Asia Minor liberation from Persian rule, while respecting the customs and privileges of non-Greek populations. This policy of calculated magnanimity would become a hallmark of Alexander's approach throughout his conquests. The young king's decision to present himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror reflected both his philosophical education under Aristotle and his practical understanding of the challenges involved in ruling a vast, multicultural empire. Alexander recognized that lasting control required more than military dominance. It demanded the willing cooperation of subject populations who saw Macedonian rule as preferable to Persian tyranny. As Alexander advanced through Asia Minor during 334 and 333 BC, his reputation began to assume mythical proportions. Stories spread throughout the region of the young Macedonian king who fought like a god, who treated his enemies with unexpected mercy, and who seemed to possess an almost supernatural understanding of human nature. These tales, whether accurate or embellished, served Alexander's strategic purposes by encouraging cities to surrender without resistance rather than face siege and potential destruction.
The most significant test of Alexander's growing reputation came in November 333 BC at the narrow coastal plain near Issus, where he encountered Darius III, the great king of Persia, in personal combat for the first time. The Persian army that faced Alexander's forces was magnificent in its diversity and numbers, including contingents from across the vast empire. Heavily armored cataphracts from Media, skilled archers from Scythia, war elephants from India, and the elite immortals who served as the great king's personal guard. Darius himself was everything that Alexander was not, a mature ruler in his 40s with decades of administrative experience, commanding resources that dwarfed anything available to the young Macedonian. The Persian emperor's army numbered perhaps 100,000 men, more than double Alexander's force, and included military units with centuries of battlefield experience. By every conventional measure, the 23-year-old Alexander should have been overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the forces arrayed against him. Yet the Battle of Issus would demonstrate that conventional measures meant nothing when confronted with Alexander's unique combination of tactical genius and inspirational leadership. The young king's pre-battle dispositions revealed his sophisticated understanding of how to maximize his army's advantages while minimizing the impact of Persian numerical superiority. Alexander positioned his forces to prevent the Persians from fully deploying their larger army, effectively neutralizing much of Darius's advantage in numbers. More significantly, Alexander's battle plan at Issus showcased his ability to coordinate complex tactical movements while personally leading from the front. As the battle developed, the young king led his companion cavalry in a devastating charge directly at Darius's position in the center of the Persian line. This was not mere bravado, but calculated strategy. Alexander understood that defeating or capturing the great king would immediately end Persian resistance, regardless of the overall military situation. The psychological impact of Alexander's direct assault on the Persian center cannot be overstated. Here was a 23-year-old warrior king personally leading a cavalry charge against the ruler of the world's largest empire, demonstrating the kind of heroic leadership that inspired absolute devotion from his followers. The sight of their young commander risking everything in pursuit of victory convinced the Macedonian soldiers that no obstacle was insurmountable as long as Alexander led them. The climactic moment of the battle came when Alexander's cavalry charge broke through the Persian center and approached Darius's command position. The great king, seeing the young Macedonian bearing down on him with sword raised, chose flight over combat, abandoning his army, his family, and his imperial dignity in a desperate attempt to preserve his life. This moment of cowardice would haunt Darius for the rest of his reign and establish Alexander as the psychological victor in their ongoing conflict. The aftermath of Issus revealed as much about Alexander's character as the battle itself. Among the prisoners taken were Darius's family, his mother Sisygambis, his wife Statera, and his daughters. The young king's treatment of these captives became legendary throughout the ancient world for its combination of political wisdom and personal honor. Rather than using them as bargaining chips or symbols of Persian humiliation, Alexander treated the royal women with a respect that exceeded even Persian court protocol.
When Alexander first met Sisygambis, Darius's mother, she initially prostrated herself before Hephaestion, mistaking Alexander's taller and more imposing companion for the king. Upon realizing her error, she began to apologize profusely, but Alexander graciously dismissed her concern with words that revealed his sophisticated understanding of political theater. "You were not mistaken, mother, for he too is Alexander." This gesture, showing honor to both his friend and his prisoner, demonstrated the young king's ability to transform potential embarrassment into an opportunity for magnanimous leadership. Alexander's magnanimity toward Darius's family extended beyond mere courtesy to encompass genuine protection and provision. He assigned them a household befitting their royal status, ensured that they maintained their religious observances, and most significantly, promised that they would not be harmed or dishonored, regardless of future developments in his conflict with Darius. This treatment was unprecedented in ancient warfare and established Alexander's reputation as a conqueror who combined strength with justice. The political implications of Alexander's conduct of Issus extended far beyond the immediate military situation. By treating Persian nobility with honor while defeating them in battle,
the 23-year-old king began positioning himself not merely as a foreign conqueror, but as a legitimate ruler who could unite Greek and Persian traditions under a single crown. This vision would become increasingly important as Alexander's conquests expanded and he faced the challenge of governing vast populations with different languages, customs, and religious beliefs. The victory at Issus also demonstrated Alexander's understanding of the propaganda value of his actions. When Darius later sent ambassadors offering terms for peace, including a massive ransom for his family and territorial concessions in Asia Minor, Alexander's response became famous throughout the ancient world. "I do not steal victory." This declaration, rejecting the notion of a negotiated settlement, established the young king as a leader who would accept nothing less than total victory over the Persian Empire. Alexander's advisors, led by the veteran general Parmenion, counseled acceptance of Darius's generous terms. From their perspective, the young king had already achieved more than Philip had ever dreamed possible: control of Asia Minor, defeat of the great king in battle, and recognition as a major power in the eastern Mediterranean. But Alexander's vision extended far beyond such limited objectives. At 23, he was already thinking in terms of world conquest, of replacing the Persian Empire with a Macedonian-dominated realm that would stretch from Greece to India. The rejection of Darius's peace offers revealed both the audacity and the strategic logic of Alexander's ultimate objectives. The young king understood that half measures would ultimately prove unsustainable. Either he would conquer the entire Persian Empire, or it would eventually recover and destroy him. There could be no middle ground between these alternatives, no negotiated settlement that would provide lasting security for Macedonia and the Greek cities that followed Alexander's leadership.
Following his triumph at Issus, Alexander faced a crucial strategic decision that would determine the future course of his campaign. Darius had fled eastward toward Babylon and the Persian heartland, offering Alexander the opportunity to pursue him immediately and potentially end the war through a second decisive victory. However, the young king chose instead to secure his western flank by conquering the Phoenician cities and Egypt, ensuring that no Persian naval force could threaten his communications or supply lines. This decision to march south rather than east demonstrated Alexander's sophisticated understanding of the logistical challenges involved in conquering a continental empire. Unlike previous Greek expeditions into Asia, which had been essentially raids dependent on rapid movement and early return to base, Alexander was planning a systematic conquest that would require secure supply lines and reliable bases of operation. Egypt, with its vast wealth and strategic position, would provide exactly the kind of secure base that such an ambitious campaign required. The siege of Tyre in 332 BC became one of Alexander's most famous military achievements, demonstrating his ability to overcome obstacles that conventional wisdom deemed insurmountable. The Phoenician city, built on an island fortress and supplied by the most powerful navy in the Mediterranean, had never been taken by a land-based army. Previous conquerors, including the Babylonians and Persians, had either bypassed Tyre or accepted nominal submission in lieu of actual conquest. Alexander's solution to the challenge posed by Tyre's island fortress revealed the combination of engineering innovation and strategic persistence that characterized his entire approach to warfare. Rather than accepting the conventional wisdom that the city was impregnable, the 23-year-old king ordered the construction of a causeway across the narrow strait separating the island from the mainland.
This massive engineering project, requiring months of labor and enormous quantities of stone and timber, seemed to many observers like the fantasy of a megalomaniacal youth. Yet Alexander's causeway project succeeded where conventional siege tactics would have failed, demonstrating his ability to conceive and execute solutions that transcended traditional military limitations. The capture of Tyre after a 7-month siege not only eliminated a potential naval threat, but also sent a powerful message to other cities considering resistance. Alexander of Macedon would overcome any obstacle, no matter how formidable, in pursuit of his objectives. The fall of Tyre opened the path to Egypt, where Alexander encountered a situation unlike anything he had experienced in his previous conquests. Rather than facing military resistance, the 24-year-old king was welcomed as a liberator by a population that had grown to despise Persian rule. The Egyptians, with their ancient traditions of pharaonic kingship and religious sophistication, saw in Alexander not just another foreign conqueror, but a potential pharaoh who could restore their independence and respect their cultural traditions. Alexander's coronation as pharaoh of Egypt in Memphis during the winter of 332–331 BC represented a transformative moment in his personal development and his understanding of kingship. The elaborate ceremonies, conducted according to traditions that stretched back over 2 millennia, introduced the young Macedonian to concepts of divine kingship that went far beyond anything he had encountered in the Greek world. For the first time, Alexander was not just a successful military commander, but a god-king, whose authority derived from divine sanction rather than merely human achievement. The psychological impact of his Egyptian coronation on Alexander's self-perception cannot be overstated. At 24, he had been acknowledged as divine by one of the world's most ancient and sophisticated civilizations. The philosophical implications of this recognition, combined with his unbroken string of military victories, began to convince Alexander that his earlier claims of divine parentage might be literally true rather than merely politically convenient. The climactic moment of Alexander's transformation into a divine ruler came during his pilgrimage to the oracle of Amun Zeus at the oasis of Siwa in the Libyan desert. This journey, undertaken with a small party through some of the world's most hostile terrain, represented far more than mere religious observance. Alexander was seeking confirmation of his divine nature from one of the ancient world's most respected oracles, a recognition that would validate his increasingly grandiose claims about his own destiny. The details of Alexander's consultation with the oracle remain shrouded in mystery, but the young king emerged from the temple convinced that he had received divine confirmation of his status as son of Zeus Amun. Whether this conviction represented genuine religious experience, calculated political theater, or some combination of both, its effects on Alexander's subsequent behavior were profound. From Siwa onward, the 24-year-old king increasingly demanded recognition of his divine status from both his followers and his subjects.
The establishment of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile represented Alexander's most lasting contribution to Egyptian civilization and one of his most successful attempts to create a synthesis of Greek and Eastern cultures. The city's location, carefully chosen by Alexander himself, reflected his understanding of both commercial and strategic considerations. Positioned to control trade between the Mediterranean and the interior of Africa, Alexandria would become one of the ancient world's greatest centers of learning and culture. The founding of Alexandria also demonstrated Alexander's vision of himself as more than just a conqueror. At 24,
He was already thinking in terms of lasting cultural and intellectual legacy, creating institutions that would preserve and extend Greek civilization long after his military victories had faded into history. The great library and museum of Alexandria, though established after Alexander's death, fulfilled the vision of cultural synthesis that the young king had articulated during the city's foundation. By the time Alexander prepared to leave Egypt in 331 BC, he had accomplished something unprecedented in the ancient world. At 25, he had not only defeated the Persian Empire's western provinces, but had established himself as a legitimate ruler in the eyes of populations with radically different cultural and religious traditions. The young man who had entered Asia as the king of a relatively minor Greek kingdom was preparing to return to the battlefield as a god-king whose authority transcended traditional ethnic and national boundaries. The 25-year-old Alexander, who marched north from Egypt to face Darius in the final decisive battle of their conflict, carried with him not just military confidence, but a transformed understanding of his own nature and destiny. The victories at Granicus and Issus had established his military genius, but the conquest of Egypt had revealed possibilities that went far beyond mere military success. Alexander now envisioned himself not just as the conqueror of the Persian Empire, but as the founder of a new kind of world order that would unite East and West under divine authority. The stage was set for the climactic confrontation at Gaugamela, where Alexander would face not just Darius and the assembled might of the Persian Empire, but also the ultimate test of his own divine pretensions. The young god-king who had emerged from the deserts of Egypt would soon discover whether his claims to divinity could survive the supreme trial of battle against impossible odds.
Part 7. The Conqueror of Conquerors. Gaugamela to India. A 25-year-old breaks the world. The autumn of 331 BC found 25-year-old Alexander facing the supreme test of his military genius and divine pretensions. On the plains of Gaugamela, near the ancient city of Nineveh, Darius III had assembled what was arguably the largest army in human history up to that point. The great king, learning from his previous defeats, had chosen a battlefield that favored his numerical superiority while negating Alexander's tactical advantages. The flat, open terrain stretched endlessly in all directions, providing perfect conditions for the deployment of cavalry, war elephants, and the devastating scythed chariots that Darius hoped would break the Macedonian phalanx before Alexander could bring his tactical brilliance to bear. The Persian army that awaited Alexander was a testament to the vast resources and diversity of the world's greatest empire. Modern estimates suggest that Darius commanded perhaps 250,000 men, drawn from every corner of his realm. The colorful host included heavily armored cataphracts from Media and Parthia, skilled horse archers from the Scythian steppes, war elephants from India, and contingents of Greek mercenaries who knew Macedonian tactics intimately. At the center of this vast array stood the Immortals, the elite guard unit that had never tasted defeat, their golden shields gleaming in the morning sun. Against this overwhelming force, Alexander could field fewer than 47,000 men, many of whom were exhausted from the long march north from Egypt. The disparity in numbers was so extreme that some of Alexander's most experienced generals privately questioned whether the young king's legendary confidence had finally led him into an impossible situation. Parmian, the veteran commander who had served under Philip II, reportedly advised a night attack to avoid facing the full Persian army in daylight.
Alexander's response to this suggestion became one of his most famous declarations, encapsulating both his personal honor and his understanding of psychological warfare. "I will not steal victory like a thief in the night." This rejection of what might have been sound tactical advice revealed the 25-year-old king's conviction that legitimate victory required not just success, but success achieved through superior courage and skill. Alexander understood that a victory won through stealth would lack the psychological impact necessary to break Persian resistance permanently. The night before Gaugamela, while his generals held anxious war councils and his soldiers prepared their weapons with nervous energy, Alexander displayed the kind of serene confidence that had become his trademark. According to his companions, the young king slept soundly, so peacefully that his bodyguards had difficulty waking him on the morning of battle. This apparent calm in the face of overwhelming odds was not mere bravado, but reflected Alexander's absolute faith in his own divine protection and tactical genius.
When morning came and Alexander finally emerged from his tent, he found his army drawn up in battle formation, but clearly apprehensive about the magnitude of the force arrayed against them. The sight of the Persian host stretching beyond the horizon might have intimidated even veteran soldiers, but Alexander's presence immediately transformed their anxiety into anticipation. The young king's confidence was infectious, and his soldiers began to believe that they were about to witness another of his miraculous victories. Alexander's tactical dispositions at Gaugamela revealed the full maturation of his military genius. Rather than attempting to match the Persians' numerical superiority across the entire front, he concentrated his best troops at the crucial points while creating a flexible formation capable of responding to multiple threats simultaneously. The famous Macedonian phalanx anchored the center, while elite cavalry units protected the flanks and served as mobile reserves ready to exploit any opportunity that developed. Most significantly, Alexander positioned himself at the head of the companion cavalry on the right wing, directly opposite the section of the Persian line where intelligence reports indicated Darius would position himself. This was not mere personal courage, but calculated strategy. Alexander had recognized that the psychological impact of defeating or capturing the great king would be worth any personal risk to himself. The battle began at dawn with a Persian assault that seemed to validate Darius's confidence in his overwhelming numerical advantage. The scythed chariots, designed to break up infantry formations through sheer terror, thundered across the plain toward the Macedonian line. These fearsome weapons, equipped with rotating blades that could dismember men and horses alike, had proven devastatingly effective in previous battles against conventional armies. However, Alexander had anticipated this tactic and prepared countermeasures that neutralized the chariots' effectiveness. Rather than presenting a solid wall of shields for the chariots to strike, the Macedonian infantry opened narrow corridors that allowed the vehicles to pass harmlessly through their formation. Javelin throwers positioned in these gaps targeted the chariot crews, while the horses, deprived of targets, gradually lost momentum and were easily captured or destroyed. The failure of the chariot attack created the first crack in Persian confidence, but Darius still possessed overwhelming advantages in cavalry and infantry numbers. The great king's battle plan called for his superior cavalry to envelop both Macedonian flanks, while his center engaged Alexander's phalanx in a grinding battle of attrition. Given the enormous disparity in numbers, this strategy should have succeeded regardless of Alexander's tactical skill. What Darius had not anticipated was Alexander's ability to identify and exploit the critical moment when tactical calculation could transform numerical disadvantage into decisive victory. As the battle developed and the Persian cavalry began their enveloping movements, Alexander noticed a gap developing in the enemy center, where units had been shifted to support the flanking operations. This gap represented both opportunity and enormous risk. A successful attack might break the Persian army, but failure would leave Alexander's forces hopelessly outnumbered and surrounded.
The moment that defined Gaugamela, and perhaps Alexander's entire career, came when the 25-year-old king made the split-second decision to commit his elite companion cavalry to a direct assault on the weakened Persian center. Leading from the front as always, Alexander spurred his horse Bucephalus toward the gap, followed by 3,000 of the finest heavy cavalry in the ancient world. This charge was not a desperate gamble, but the culmination of careful tactical preparation combined with perfect timing. The impact of Alexander's cavalry assault on the Persian center was catastrophic. The young king's tactical instincts had been perfect. The gap he had identified was real, and the Persian units on either side were unable to close it quickly enough to prevent penetration. Within minutes, Alexander's cavalry had broken through the enemy line and was driving toward Darius's command position, creating exactly the kind of crisis that could transform tactical advantage into strategic victory. The psychological effect of Alexander's appearance in the Persian rear areas cannot be overstated. Here was the young Macedonian king, personally leading his elite cavalry in a charge that had seemingly appeared from nowhere, bearing down on the great king of Persia with sword raised and divine confidence blazing in his eyes. The sight terrified Persian soldiers who had been taught from childhood that the great king was the earthly representative of Ahura Mazda, the supreme deity of their religion. For the second time in his reign, Darius faced the choice between personal combat with Alexander and ignominious flight. Once again, the great king chose survival over honor, abandoning his army, his imperial regalia, and his remaining credibility as a leader worth following. The moment Darius turned his chariot away from the approaching Macedonians, his army began to disintegrate as word spread that their divine king had fled the battlefield. The rout that followed Darius's flight became one of the most complete victories in military history. The Persian army, which had outnumbered Alexander's force by more than 5-1, simply ceased to exist as an organized fighting unit. Soldiers threw down their weapons and fled in all directions, while their commanders abandoned any attempt to maintain order. Within hours, the greatest army ever assembled by the Persian Empire had been destroyed by a 25-year-old who combined tactical genius with absolute courage. The immediate aftermath of Gaugamela revealed the magnitude of Alexander's achievement. Among the spoils captured was Darius's personal baggage train, including the portable palace that accompanied the great king on campaign. The wealth seized was so vast that it took months to catalog and distribute, providing Alexander with the financial resources necessary to maintain his army for years of additional campaigning. More importantly, the victory established Alexander as the undisputed master of the Persian Empire's western provinces. However, Alexander's response to victory at Gaugamela demonstrated that his ambitions extended far beyond mere conquest of existing territories. Rather than consolidating his gains and establishing a defensive perimeter, the 25-year-old king immediately began planning further advances into regions that no Greek had ever seen. The young conqueror who had broken the Persian army was already envisioning campaigns that would carry his standards to the ends of the known world.
The march to Babylon, following Gaugamela, became a triumphal procession that revealed Alexander's sophisticated understanding of political theater. Rather than entering the ancient city as a foreign conqueror, he presented himself as a liberator who had freed the Babylonians from Persian oppression. This approach, reflecting lessons learned during his conquest of Egypt, demonstrated Alexander's evolution from a purely military commander into a political leader capable of governing diverse populations. Alexander's entry into Babylon was carefully orchestrated to maximize its psychological impact while respecting local religious sensibilities. The young king made public sacrifices to Marduk, the city's patron deity, and ordered the restoration of temples that the Persians had neglected or destroyed. These gestures cost him nothing militarily, but gained him enormous political advantages by presenting him as a legitimate ruler rather than a foreign invader. From Babylon, Alexander advanced to Susa, where he seized the accumulated treasures of centuries of Persian rule. The wealth captured at Susa was almost incomprehensible in its magnitude. Modern estimates suggest that Alexander gained control of precious metals worth billions of dollars in contemporary currency. This financial windfall provided the resources necessary for the next phase of his conquests, but it also began to transform the young king's lifestyle in ways that would eventually create tensions with his Macedonian followers. The capture of Persepolis in 330 BC represented both the culmination of Alexander's Persian campaign and the beginning of a new phase in his personal development. The ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, with its magnificent palaces and artistic treasures, symbolized everything that Alexander had set out to destroy. Yet his treatment of the city revealed the complex emotions that drove the 26-year-old conqueror as he stood on the threshold of world domination. Initially, Alexander showed his customary restraint and political wisdom, ordering his soldiers to respect the city's inhabitants and preserve its cultural treasures. However, during a banquet celebrating the capture of Persepolis, the young king made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Whether influenced by wine, the persuasive arguments of his companions, or his own desire for symbolic revenge against the empire that had threatened Greece for generations, Alexander ordered the burning of Xerxes' palace. The destruction of Persepolis became one of the most controversial acts of Alexander's career. Some sources suggest that he immediately regretted the decision, recognizing that it contradicted his stated policy of presenting himself as the legitimate successor to the Persian kings rather than merely their destroyer. Yet the act also demonstrated the emotional complexity of the 26-year-old who had accomplished more than any conqueror in history, but still struggled to balance his various roles as Macedonian king, Greek liberator, and Persian successor. Following the destruction of Persepolis, Alexander spent the next 2 years pursuing Darius through the eastern provinces of the Persian Empire. This phase of the campaign revealed new aspects of the young king's character, as he encountered landscapes and cultures that challenged all his previous assumptions about the nature of the world. The pursuit of Darius through Media, Parthia, and Bactria introduced Alexander to the vast spaces and harsh climates of Central Asia, testing his army's endurance while expanding his understanding of geography and human diversity.
The final confrontation between Alexander and Darius never occurred. In 330 BC, as the 26-year-old Macedonian king closed in on his longtime adversary, Darius was assassinated by his own nobles, led by Bessus, the satrap of Bactria. This ignoble end to the great king's life denied Alexander the personal triumph he had long sought, but it also eliminated the last legitimate claimant to the Persian throne, and cleared the way for Alexander to present himself as the rightful successor to the Achaemenid dynasty. Alexander's reaction to news of Darius's assassination revealed both his political intelligence and his personal honor. Rather than celebrating the elimination of his greatest enemy, the young king ordered an elaborate funeral for Darius and declared his intention to punish the assassins. This response served multiple political purposes. It demonstrated Alexander's respect for legitimate authority, presented him as the avenger of royal dignity, and provided justification for continued military operations in the eastern provinces. The pursuit and execution of Darius's assassins led Alexander deeper into Central Asia than any Greek had ever penetrated. The campaigns in Sogdiana and Bactria, lasting from 330 to 327 BC, tested the young king's military skills against enemies who employed guerrilla tactics perfectly suited to their mountainous terrain. These operations also revealed Alexander's growing appreciation for the military capabilities of non-Greek peoples, leading him to incorporate Bactrian and Sogdian cavalry units into his own army. During the Bactrian campaigns, Alexander's personal life underwent a transformation that would have profound implications for his relationship with his Macedonian followers. His marriage to Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian noble, was both a political alliance designed to secure local support and a genuine love match that revealed the 27-year-old king's capacity for deep emotional attachment. However, this marriage also symbolized Alexander's increasing adoption of Persian customs and his evolution away from his purely Macedonian identity. By 327 BC, as Alexander prepared to cross the Hindu Kush mountains and enter India, he had already accomplished far more than his father Philip or his teacher Aristotle could have imagined possible. At 29, he controlled an empire stretching from Greece to Central Asia, commanded the loyalty of dozens of different ethnic groups, and possessed wealth that exceeded the treasuries of all previous conquerors combined. Yet the young king's appetite for conquest remained unsatisfied, driving him toward new challenges that would test both his military genius and his soldiers' devotion. The decision to invade India represented the culmination of Alexander's evolution from a Macedonian prince seeking to fulfill his father's dreams into a world conqueror driven by his own vision of unlimited possibility. The 29-year-old who prepared to cross the Indus River had already surpassed every hero of legend, but he remained convinced that even greater achievements lay ahead. The boy who had once wept because there were no more worlds to conquer was about to discover just how vast the world really was.
Part 8. The Price of Godhood. When Gods Bleed, the Dark Side of Divinity. The crossing of the Hindu Kush Mountains in 327 BC marked a turning point not only in Alexander's geographical conquests, but in his psychological and spiritual journey. At 29, the young king who had already surpassed every hero of legend found himself entering a realm that challenged his fundamental understanding of the world. India presented Alexander with military challenges unlike any he had previously encountered. But more significantly, it confronted him with philosophical and religious traditions that questioned the very nature of divinity and kingship that he had come to embody. The Indian campaign began with Alexander's characteristic boldness and tactical innovation. His crossing of the Indus River in the face of determined resistance demonstrated once again his ability to overcome obstacles that conventional wisdom deemed insurmountable. However, the young king soon discovered that conquering Indian territory was only the beginning of his challenges. The subcontinent's climate, geography, and military traditions all conspired to test his army's endurance and his own leadership capabilities in unprecedented ways. The battle against King Porus near the Hydaspes River in 326 BC became one of Alexander's greatest tactical triumphs, but it also revealed the increasing psychological strain that continuous warfare was placing on the 29-year-old conqueror. The Indian king's army included war elephants on a scale that dwarfed anything Alexander had previously encountered, and the monsoon rains turned the battlefield into a muddy nightmare that negated many traditional Macedonian advantages. Alexander's victory over Porus demonstrated his continued tactical brilliance, but the aftermath of the battle revealed troubling changes in the young king's character. His treatment of the defeated Indian monarch was consistent with his usual magnanimity, but his increasing demands for recognition of his divine status began to alienate even his closest companions. The 29-year-old who had once been content with the loyalty and respect of his soldiers now demanded the kind of worship typically reserved for gods. The psychological transformation that Alexander underwent during his Indian campaigns was gradual but unmistakable. The young man who had begun his conquests as a Macedonian king seeking to fulfill his father's dreams had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a living god whose authority transcended all traditional boundaries. This evolution brought with it a degree of isolation that would have been unimaginable to the teenage prince who had once studied philosophy with Aristotle.
The most visible manifestation of Alexander's changing relationship with his followers came through his adoption of Persian court ceremonies, particularly the practice of proskynesis, the prostration that Persian subjects performed before their kings. To Macedonians, who had always treated their monarchs as first among equals rather than divine beings, this demand for prostration represented a fundamental betrayal of their cultural values and personal dignity. The crisis over proskynesis revealed the extent to which Alexander's divine pretensions had begun to separate him from the men who had followed him from Macedonia to the ends of the known world. These veterans, many of whom had served under Philip II and remembered when Alexander was simply another young noble learning the arts of war, found it increasingly difficult to reconcile their memories of the mortal prince with the divine king who now demanded their worship. Alexander's insistence on divine honors was not mere personal vanity, but reflected his sophisticated understanding of the political requirements of ruling a vast multicultural empire. The young king recognized that traditional Macedonian concepts of kingship were inadequate for governing subjects who came from dozens of different cultural traditions. By presenting himself as a divine figure who transcended ethnic and national boundaries, Alexander sought to create a form of legitimacy that could unite Greeks, Persians, Indians, and all the other peoples under his rule. However, this political logic came at an enormous personal cost. The increasing isolation that accompanied Alexander's divine status began to affect his emotional stability and his relationships with the people who mattered most to him. The spontaneous camaraderie that had characterized his early campaigns gave way to a more formal and distant relationship with his officers, while his old friends found themselves struggling to navigate the complex etiquette that now surrounded their former companion. The most tragic consequence of Alexander's psychological transformation came during a banquet in Samarkand in 328 BC, when the 30-year-old king committed the act that would haunt him for the rest of his brief life. During an evening of heavy drinking and increasingly heated political discussion, Clytus the Black, the man who had saved Alexander's life at the Granicus River, dared to criticize the king's adoption of Persian customs and his growing estrangement from traditional Macedonian values. Clytus's criticism struck at the heart of Alexander's deepest insecurities about the path his life had taken. The older general's words carried particular weight because of his long service and personal loyalty, but they also represented everything that Alexander was trying to leave behind in his evolution toward divine kingship. The confrontation between the two men escalated rapidly, fueled by wine and years of accumulated tension over the direction of Alexander's reign.
The climactic moment came when Cletus declared that Alexander owed his victories not to his own divine nature, but to the courage of his Macedonian soldiers and the legacy of his father, Philip II. This direct challenge to Alexander's divine pretensions, delivered by the man who had once saved his life, pushed the 30-year-old king beyond the limits of rational control. In a moment of rage that revealed the volatile emotions lurking beneath his divine facade, Alexander seized a spear from one of his guards and drove it through Cletus's chest. The immediate aftermath of Cletus's murder revealed the full extent of Alexander's psychological deterioration. As the reality of what he had done penetrated his wine-fueled rage, the king collapsed in grief and horror. For 3 days, Alexander refused to eat or drink, lying in his tent and contemplating suicide while his army waited in stunned silence. The man who had claimed divine status had committed an act of impulsive violence that revealed his essential humanity in the most tragic way possible. Alexander's recovery from this psychological crisis required the intervention of his court philosophers and the loyal support of his remaining companions. However, the damage to his relationships and his own self-perception was irreversible. The 30-year-old king who emerged from his tent after 3 days of isolation was forever changed, haunted by the knowledge that his divine pretensions had led him to murder one of his oldest and most loyal friends. The incident with Cletus marked the beginning of a period of increasing paranoia and suspicion that would characterize Alexander's final years. The king who had once trusted his companions implicitly now saw potential threats everywhere, interpreting criticism as treason and loyalty as potential betrayal. This psychological transformation was particularly tragic because it occurred just as Alexander achieved the height of his military success, commanding an empire larger than any in human history. The growing paranoia that plagued Alexander's final years manifested itself in various ways, from his treatment of suspected conspirators to his increasingly elaborate security arrangements. The spontaneous accessibility that had once characterized his leadership gave way to complex protocols designed to protect him from both real and imagined threats. The young king who had once shared the dangers and hardships of campaign life with his soldiers now lived in an isolation that was as much psychological as physical.
Alexander's marriage to Roxana in 327 BC represented both a political masterstroke and a personal turning point that further complicated his relationships with his Macedonian followers. The Bactrian princess's beauty and intelligence made her a suitable partner for a divine king, but her foreign origins and different cultural background symbolized Alexander's continuing evolution away from his Macedonian roots. This marriage, while politically advantageous, created additional tensions within an army that was already struggling to adapt to their king's changing identity. The young queen's pregnancy added another layer of complexity to Alexander's political situation, as it raised questions about the succession and the future direction of the empire. The prospect of a half-Bactrian heir to the Macedonian throne troubled many of Alexander's old companions, who worried that their own cultural traditions and political interests would be marginalized in favor of Alexander's increasingly cosmopolitan vision of empire. The Indian campaigns also revealed Alexander's growing fascination with Eastern philosophical and religious traditions that challenged his Greek-influenced worldview. His encounters with Indian philosophers, particularly the gymnosophists or naked sages, introduced him to concepts of spiritual discipline and world renunciation that seemed to offer alternatives to the relentless pursuit of conquest and glory that had defined his life since childhood. These philosophical encounters may have contributed to Alexander's eventual decision to halt his eastward advance at the Hyphasis River in 326 BC. When his army finally refused to march further into the Indian interior, the 30-year-old king faced the first successful challenge to his authority since ascending the throne.
The mutiny of his soldiers, while respectful in its presentation, represented a fundamental rejection of Alexander's vision of unlimited conquest and divine authority. The speech that Alexander delivered to his mutinous army revealed both his continued rhetorical brilliance and his deep sense of betrayal at their refusal to follow him further. The king who had led these men through decades of victorious campaigning could not understand their reluctance to continue an adventure that had already exceeded every previous human achievement. His famous declaration, "I would rather live a short life of glory than a long one of obscurity," encapsulated the philosophy that had driven him since youth, but which his soldiers no longer shared. The army's refusal to advance beyond the hyphasis forced Alexander to confront the limitations of even divine authority when confronted with exhausted human nature. For the first time in his career, the 30-year-old king was compelled to abandon a military objective not because of enemy resistance, but because of the limits of his own followers' endurance. This experience may have contributed to his growing sense of isolation and his increasingly erratic behavior in the final years of his life. The return journey down the Indus River and through the Gedrosian Desert became an extended ordeal that tested Alexander's leadership capabilities and his army's loyalty under the most extreme conditions. The desert crossing, in particular, became a nightmare of heat, thirst, and starvation that claimed thousands of lives and pushed even Alexander's most devoted followers to the brink of mutiny. The young king's decision to share his soldiers' hardships during this ordeal demonstrated that some aspects of his original character remained intact despite the psychological changes he had undergone. However, the suffering endured during the Gedrosian crossing also intensified Alexander's sense that he was somehow different from ordinary mortals. His survival of conditions that killed thousands of his soldiers seemed to confirm his divine nature in his own mind, while simultaneously increasing his sense of separation from the human condition. The 31-year-old who emerged from the desert was more convinced than ever of his own divinity, but also more isolated from normal human relationships. The final phase of Alexander's life, from his return to Babylon in 324 BC until his death in 323 BC, was marked by increasingly grandiose plans and increasingly desperate attempts to recapture the sense of purpose and camaraderie that had characterized his early campaigns. His mass wedding at Susa, where he married thousands of his soldiers to Persian women, represented both his vision of cultural fusion and his recognition that the old bonds holding his army together were dissolving. As Alexander approached his 32nd birthday, he had accomplished everything that any human being could reasonably aspire to achieve. His empire stretched from Macedonia to India. His name was known throughout the civilized world, and his military reputation was unrivaled in human history. Yet the psychological price of these achievements had been enormous, transforming the promising young prince into an isolated and increasingly unstable god-king whose divine pretensions had cost him the human relationships that once gave his life meaning. The young man who had once wept because there were no more worlds to conquer now faced a different kind of limitation. The recognition that even unlimited power and divine status could not overcome the fundamental loneliness that accompanied his transformation from mortal hero into living god.
Part 9. Death of a God at 32. June 323 BC, when legends die young. The spring of 323 BC found 32-year-old Alexander at the pinnacle of human achievement, yet also at the most precarious moment of his extraordinary life. Returning to Babylon after the harrowing march through the Gedrosian Desert and the complex political negotiations that had restored order to his vast empire, the young king threw himself into planning campaigns that would have dwarfed even his previous conquests. His court buzzed with preparations for expeditions to Arabia, perhaps even to the mysterious lands beyond the Western Ocean that some philosophers claimed existed. At an age when most men were just beginning to contemplate their life's work,
Alexander was planning conquests that would extend his empire to the very edges of the known world. Yet beneath the surface of these grandiose plans lay troubling signs that the physical and psychological toll of 13 years of continuous warfare was finally catching up with the man who had seemed almost superhuman in his endurance. The 32-year-old Alexander, who held court in the ancient palace of Nebuchadnezzar, was no longer the vigorous young prince who had crossed the Hellespont 18 years earlier. The accumulated stress of commanding armies across 3 continents, the emotional trauma of personal betrayals and necessary executions, and the sheer physical exhaustion of campaign life had begun to erode even his legendary constitution. The most immediate challenge facing Alexander in his final months was not military but administrative and personal. The empire he had conquered was proving far more difficult to govern than it had been to conquer. Despite his attempts to create a fusion of Greek and Persian cultures, tensions persisted between his Macedonian veterans and the increasingly cosmopolitan court that surrounded him. Many of his oldest companions felt alienated by his adoption of Persian customs and his marriage to 𝔥𝔦𝔰, while the Persian nobility remained suspicious of his ultimate intentions toward their traditional privileges and religious practices. Alexander's response to these challenges revealed both his continued political acumen and his growing impatience with the mundane realities of governance. Rather than focusing exclusively on administrative consolidation, he chose to address internal tensions through the prospect of new conquests that would unite his diverse followers in common purpose. This approach had worked successfully throughout his career, but it also reflected an inability or unwillingness to accept the limitations that even divine authority must acknowledge when confronted with practical realities. The planning for the Arabian expedition consumed much of Alexander's energy during his final months. This campaign was intended to secure the valuable trade routes that brought spices and precious stones from the east, while also providing his army with the kind of adventure and plunder that had always cemented their loyalty. The strategic logic was sound. Control of Arabian trade routes would provide enormous revenues, while the conquest of new territories would satisfy his soldiers' desire for continued advancement and enrichment.
However, the Arabian project also revealed troubling aspects of Alexander's psychological state during his final period. The 32-year-old king seemed driven by an almost compulsive need to surpass his own previous achievements, as if only continuous conquest could validate his divine status and justify the sacrifices that his ambitions had demanded from himself and his followers. This restless energy, while impressive in its scope and ambition, also suggested an underlying dissatisfaction with even his unprecedented accomplishments. The young king's personal relationships during this final period reflected the isolation that had increasingly characterized his position since achieving divine status. His marriage to 𝔥𝔦𝔰, while politically advantageous and apparently based on genuine affection, could not provide the kind of intimate companionship that Alexander had once enjoyed with figures like Hephaestion. The protocols and suspicions that necessarily surrounded a divine monarch made spontaneous friendship virtually impossible, leaving Alexander emotionally isolated despite being constantly surrounded by courtiers and advisors. The death of Hephaestion in 324 BC had removed the last person who could relate to Alexander as an equal rather than as a subject or supplicant. The loss of his closest friend and probable lover devastated the 31-year-old king in ways that revealed the emotional vulnerability he typically concealed beneath his divine facade. Alexander's grief at Hephaestion's death was so extreme that it alarmed even his closest associates, who worried that their king might be losing his psychological balance under the accumulated pressures of his position. Alexander's reaction to Hephaestion's death included elaborate funeral ceremonies that rivaled those typically reserved for deceased monarchs, as well as plans to establish a hero cult that would ensure his friend's posthumous worship throughout the empire. These gestures, while touching in their sincerity, also demonstrated the extent to which Alexander's sense of proportion had been distorted by years of absolute power and divine pretensions. The 31-year-old who ordered these elaborate honors was no longer capable of distinguishing between appropriate expressions of grief and the kind of extravagant displays that his subjects expected from their god-king. The final months of Alexander's life were also marked by increasingly ambitious architectural and cultural projects that reflected his vision of lasting legacy beyond mere military conquest. Plans for new cities, temples, and monuments occupied much of his attention, as did schemes for massive engineering projects that would demonstrate Macedonian capabilities while providing practical benefits to his subjects. The young king who had once been content with military glory now sought to transform the physical landscape of his empire in ways that would commemorate his achievements for future generations.
These grandiose construction projects, while impressive in their scope, also revealed Alexander's growing disconnection from financial and practical realities. The resources required for his planned monuments and cities were enormous, placing additional strain on an imperial treasury that was already stretched by the costs of maintaining armies across 3 continents. The 32-year-old who approved these expenditures seemed to believe that his divine status exempted him from the kind of fiscal constraints that limited ordinary monarchs. The banquet of May 29, 323 BC, began as a typical evening of celebration and camaraderie among Alexander's inner circle. The king, despite his recent concerns about security and potential conspiracies, appeared relaxed and confident as he shared wine and conversation with his companions. The gathering included both old Macedonian veterans and newer additions to his court, reflecting the cultural fusion that Alexander had spent years trying to achieve within his administration. According to the various accounts that survive, the evening proceeded normally until Alexander began consuming wine with an intensity that alarmed even companions accustomed to his capacity for alcohol. Whether driven by stress, grief over Hephaestion's death, or simply the desire to recapture some semblance of the camaraderie that had once characterized his relationships, the 32-year-old king drank far more heavily than was typical even for him. The immediate aftermath of the banquet saw Alexander complaining of severe abdominal pain and fever, symptoms that initially seemed consistent with the kind of illness that commonly afflicted armies campaigning in hot climates. However, as hours passed and his condition worsened rather than improved, it became clear that this was not an ordinary bout of camp fever, but something far more serious. The king, who had survived wounds, exhaustion, and diseases that had killed thousands of his soldiers, was facing a medical crisis that his legendary constitution could not overcome. The 12 days that followed became a death watch that transfixed the ancient world. Bulletins about Alexander's condition were dispatched throughout the empire, while his generals and advisers struggled to maintain order in an increasingly tense situation. The possibility that their god-king might actually be mortal, despite his divine pretensions and seemingly supernatural achievements, forced everyone connected with the empire to contemplate scenarios they had never seriously considered.
Alexander's behavior during his final illness revealed both his continued concern for his empire's welfare and his recognition that his time was limited. Despite his physical deterioration, he continued to receive reports and issue orders regarding ongoing military and administrative matters. The 32-year-old who lay dying in Babylon remained focused on the practical requirements of governing a vast realm, even as his body failed him with increasing rapidity. The young king's lucid moments during his final days were devoted largely to ensuring the continuity of his empire and the welfare of his soldiers. He met with his generals to discuss the disposition of his forces and the continuation of planned campaigns. Most significantly, he made arrangements for the care of his pregnant wife Roxana and the child she carried, who might someday inherit at least a portion of the realm that Alexander had conquered through sheer force of will and tactical genius. As Alexander's condition deteriorated beyond any hope of recovery, his companions were forced to confront questions about succession that the young king had consistently avoided addressing directly. His failure to name a clear heir reflected both his youth — few 32-year-olds expect to die imminently — and perhaps his unconscious assumption that his divine nature would somehow exempt him from mortal limitations. This oversight would prove catastrophic for the empire's stability in the years following his death. The famous exchange regarding succession occurred when Alexander was no longer capable of extended speech, but retained enough consciousness to respond to direct questions. When asked who should inherit his empire, his response, "To the strongest," was characteristically ambiguous, reflecting either political wisdom or physical incapacity to provide more detailed instructions. This answer, while consistent with Macedonian traditions of competitive succession, virtually guaranteed the civil wars that would eventually fragment his empire among his generals. The final day of Alexander's life, June 10, 323 BC, began with the young king still conscious but clearly approaching the end of his extraordinary journey. His generals and companions maintained a vigil around his bedside, while outside the palace, word spread throughout Babylon that the god-king who had seemed immortal was actually dying like any ordinary mortal. The psychological impact of this realization on his subjects was profound, challenging fundamental assumptions about divine authority and the nature of human achievement. Alexander's death, when it finally came, was remarkably peaceful for someone whose life had been defined by constant action and violent confrontation. The 32-year-old who had conquered most of the known world simply slipped away, leaving behind an empire larger than any before or since, but no clear mechanism for its continued governance. The silence that followed his last breath marked the end not just of an individual life, but of an entire historical epoch.
The immediate aftermath of Alexander's death revealed the fragility of even the most impressive human achievements when they depend entirely on a single individual's capabilities. Within hours of his passing, his generals began maneuvering for advantage in the succession struggle that everyone had dreaded, but no one had adequately prepared for. The empire that had been held together by Alexander's personal authority and vision began to fracture along ethnic, geographical, and personal lines that would eventually reduce it to a collection of competing kingdoms. Yet even as his political legacy crumbled, Alexander's cultural and psychological impact on the ancient world continued to expand. The young king who had died at 32 had compressed more achievement into his brief life than seemed humanly possible, establishing standards of excellence and ambition that would inspire and challenge future generations. His example demonstrated both the extraordinary heights that human determination could reach and the terrible costs that such achievement might demand. The legend of Alexander began forming even before his body was cold, as stories of his achievements spread through outer world that could barely comprehend what one young man had accomplished in just 13 years of active conquest.
From Macedonia to India, from Egypt to Central Asia, peoples who had never seen Alexander personally nevertheless knew his name and marveled at tales of his victories and magnanimity. The young king who had sought to emulate and surpass Achilles had achieved something that even the legendary hero of Troy had not: true immortality through historical achievement. While Achilles lived on only in poetry and memory, Alexander's impact on the world was concrete and measurable. The cities he had founded continued to flourish. The cultural synthesis he had initiated continued to evolve, and the example he had set continued to inspire conquerors and dreamers for centuries to come. At 32, Alexander the Great had accomplished more than any individual in recorded history, transforming the ancient world through sheer force of will, tactical genius, and boundless ambition. His death marked the end of youth's triumph over experience, of vision's victory over conventional wisdom, and of one extraordinary individual's ability to reshape reality through absolute commitment to seemingly impossible dreams. The boy king who had tamed Bucephalus at 12 had spent the next 20 years taming the world itself, proving that nothing was indeed impossible for those who possessed sufficient courage to try.